For the past 3 decades, anti-immigrant policy and laws have been on the rise. Now, Congress and the Obama administration are advertising immigration reform. We get very little information from the media and from major NGOs who are promoting this reform effort. Instead, we hear the slogans, support immigration reform, it will legalize 11 million people, and it will fix the broken immigration system. But is this really true? What exactly does immigration reform mean?
The root of all this hype is a law being discussed in the Senate. This law is not called immigration reform. Its real title is Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act. The bill is advertised as a path to citizenship because it introduces a new temporary status called Registered Provisional Immigrant, or RPI. While RPI grants some benefits, it is not a full legal status. People granted RPI status will be considered lawfully present in the U.S., but not legal residents. They are authorized to work, but do not receive federal benefits. They have permission to leave the U.S. and can hold a driver license, but do not have full legal rights.
Registered Provisional Immigrant is a temporary status that must be renewed. It represents a period of probation during which changes in employment, contact with police, and many other factors can lead to losing the status. This status can also be revoked by the authorities at any time. Losing status for any reason means being subject to deportation.
All the hype around the so-called path to citizenship includes very little information about the actual provisions of the bill. The path described by the bill is not as simple as the media or as some promoters of the bill will have us believe. It is actually a series of steps. For each step, there is a complicated application process which acts as a barrier, determining who can pass on to the next step and who is rejected or excluded. The path looks something like this. People who qualify can apply for RPI. If they receive it, after 6 years they must apply to renew RPI. After 4 years or more, if other conditions are met, people can apply for a green card. And then, after at least 3 years, people can apply for citizenship. At each step of the process, the barriers are more and more complicated. More and more people are excluded and unable to move down the path. In this video, we will take a closer look at RPI to ask what kind of path to legalization is this. We will focus on RPI as it pertains to most undocumented immigrants who are not agricultural workers. We will not focus on the exceptions, such as the so-called dreamers who will receive preferential treatment.
The first barrier is applying for RPI. Not all undocumented immigrants qualify. You must prove you arrived in the U.S. before December 31st, 2011, and that you did not leave the country since then. You must pay all the back taxes the government requires, pay application fees, and $1,000 penalty. Do a series of background checks. You must complete all of this within 1 year.
You are rejected if you cannot meet all these requirements. If you have a criminal record, if you have been deported and have re-entered without permission after December 31, 2011.
The second barrier is the application to renew RPI, generally after 6 years. To move beyond this step, you must meet all previous criteria. Submit to new background checks. You must pay all federal income taxes. You must meet new employment requirements. Specifically, you must prove that you have been continuously employed for all 6 years, except for short interruptions of less than 60 days. You must prove that you are not likely to become a public charge, which is a vague criteria that is used to exclude poor people or those seen as socially undesirable. You must prove that you have earned at least the federal poverty level for all 6 previous years. You are unable to pass this barrier if you cannot meet all these requirements, cannot prove that you have been continuously employed, or if your income falls below the poverty levels. For example, minimum wage earners who work full-time and who have a household of 2 or more would be excluded. Your path may also be blocked for not providing sufficient evidence or documentation, or based on having a criminal record.
The next barrier is to apply for legal permanent residency, or LPR, aka green card. In this barrier, you must meet all RPI criteria just like in Barrier 2. However, the requirements get even tougher with an increase on the earned income of 25% above the poverty line. In other words, a household of 4 must make at least $30,000 a year to qualify. In addition, all applications for LPR will be sent to the, quote, back of the line. In other words, applicants will not be given green cards until the government is able to complete all the applications that were filed before this bill.
Okay, wait, there's a line? Actually, there are many lines with no clear start or finish, with certain countries or certain types of employment getting pushed through faster all the time. The idea that you can push folks to the end is a fallacy being promoted. Other strict requirements are added. For the first time, an English language requirement is added in order to get a green card, only for those with RPI.
Those who somehow make it to green card status can petition for citizenship after 3 years in this status. The requirements at this stage will not be changed significantly by this bill, so all current requirements will apply here. As mentioned earlier, RPI can be revoked at any time, not only during the application process, but also while in this status.
So far, we have looked just at RPI, but what is the bigger picture? RPI is not a thing on its own. It is merely one small part of a larger system of laws and homeland security policies that are directed against immigrants. In a previous video, we introduced a simplified diagram of the immigration system as a kind of deportation machine. We looked at how people are brought into the system, which in this image is represented by the big box. Once inside the system, many things can happen, depending on complicated policies and a lot of government discretion. But people can only exit the system in one of 2 ways, either by achieving citizenship or through deportation. In all the spaces of this deportation diagram, enforcement is applied. Enforcement has 2 functions. On the one hand, it works to push as many people as possible into the system so that they can be identified and processed by Homeland Security. In other words, this function of enforcement is to enable Homeland Security to find undocumented people and bring them in by force. Examples of this kind of enforcement activities include Polimigra programs such as 287G and secure communities.
The other role of enforcement is to push the entire system towards the right. This means using racist fear to create a narrative of immigrants as criminals and terrorists, as a threat to the nation. Once they are labeled as criminal and terrorists, people then are treated as though they have a lesser humanity, as people who can be disposed of. And this in turn justifies detaining and eliminating them as a form of security. For example, many laws and DHS policies define what counts as crime for immigration purposes. Other examples include DHS quotas for how many immigrants to detain and deport every year, programs that give financial incentives to local jurisdictions to imprison and prosecute immigrants, and many other programs which target immigrants as terrorists.
Once brought into the system, immigrants are hoping to find their way out this way, but enforcement works to increase the pressure to push people out this way. What happens when we look at RPI in the context of the existing immigration system? Also, how does this new bill specifically connect legalization with fear, enforcement, and security? First, we can see that the promise of so-called legalization works to convince people to voluntarily turn themselves into Homeland Security. People will be registered but still vulnerable, still not fully legalized. Once they are in the system, they cannot opt out. They will be subject to the same pressures of the system as everyone else who is brought in by force. In addition, the bill makes legalization dependent on new goals for security and enforcement. How does the bill emphasize enforcement over legalization? The bill defines 2 security triggers which control the path to legalization.
DHS must develop 2 strategic plans for how to build a new border wall and how to achieve a new set of security goals. No applications for RPI will be processed until after DHS begins to implement these plans. This first trigger takes a minimum of 180 days. Trigger 2 states that no applications from RPI to Green Card will be considered until DHS accomplishes 3 things. 1. DHS must certify to Congress that the border goals have been met and the border is effectively secure. This means 24 hours per day, 7 days per week surveillance of the border, and catching 90% of people who try to cross without permission. 2. DHS must implement a mandatory national e-verify system for all employers. 3. DHS must implement an electronic exit system to collect visa passport information from all planes or ships leaving the country.
Homeland Security will not review any applications for a green card until these goals are met. So, the path to legalization will be stuck here. More importantly, the bill puts pressure on the entire system to frame immigration as a national security issue, not an economic, labor, or human issue. This affects everyone, not just people seeking RPI status. How will DHS accomplish its new security goals?
As the U.S. continues to withdraw troops and military equipment from wars abroad, the war economy needs new markets, new fronts. This bill sets the stage for the largest expansion of militarization within the United States. $6.6 billion are set aside to militarize the entire region within 100 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border, to integrate Homeland Security with Department of Defense operations, and to give Homeland Security exceptional powers in all federal lands and all indigenous nations.
How does the bill increase the criminalization of immigrants? The bill will fund a national e-verify system, which means that the border will follow immigrants into every workplace. The bill increases the harsh criminal punishments for crossing the border without permission. The bill also invents new kinds of crimes for immigration purposes, which means that more and more people will be considered criminal aliens, making them deportable and ineligible for any kind of status. This includes people associated with a gang, even if they do not commit a crime, people who attempt to use false social security cards or passports. People with 3 or more DUI offenses will be considered aggravated felons and must be deported. The bill increases financial incentives for local police to incarcerate immigrants without convicting them, and it expands collaboration between local and federal law enforcement agencies.
Meanwhile, the House of Representatives is debating its own immigration reform proposal, which will likely be far more to the right than the Senate version. At the same time, Congress is also working out the budget of Homeland Security for the fiscal year 2014. Regardless of what happens with the so-called reform bills, Congress is increasing Homeland Security budgets in several important ways. Increase funds for all Polymigra programs, including secure communities. Increase in daily detention quotas. DHS must detain 34,000 immigrants each day, which is 600 more per day than in the year 2013.
But the media hype about immigration reform continues so that politicians can pose as champions in order to secure the immigrant vote. What is advertised as a legalization program is actually a cynical maneuver.
Yes, a complicated and tricky path to citizenship may be available for some undocumented immigrants who will be brought into the system by the promise of legal status. However, this bill also puts into motion an intensified system of oppression against all those who cannot achieve this status, and it shifts the entire immigration system to the right. Is this a victory for migrant justice movements? Should we be grateful?
The promise of benefits for some at the expense of the many is an old trick, and it is very effective. In a recent workshop, one participant described reform as a procedure that intends to incapacitate migrant social movements, to neutralize and destroy the threat they represent. They are trying to put us to sleep, she said. They are cutting into us. and giving us reform as an anesthetic so we cannot feel what is happening. We are being bribed, and we are being distracted from the struggle against the root causes of forced migration, like economic exploitation, imperialism, militarization. We are asked, are you for this reform or against it?
This is a false question. We ask, how do we build radical social movements that fight back against these root causes? What must be done to fight for justice for all, not just a compromise for the few?